All right. Welcome back to another episode of The Art of Advocacy. I am your host, Dr. Sheldon L. Eakins, host of the Leading Equity Podcast and also founder of the Leading Equity Center. That's right. We do two shows, one live and one podcast, pre-recorded. By the way, as always, this podcast is brought to you by Leading Equity, becoming an advocate for all students. I am in the hotel here in Ames, Iowa. First time out here being in Iowa. It's been interesting because I live in Idaho, and I always get folks asking me about corn and all this. The mix up is real. The mix up is real. So I even talked about that in my speech today. But I was on stage, and I also did a workshop with the principals as we're just getting ready for the next school year. I was really excited. A really good group of folks that I was working with. Great crowd, great audience, and it was very exciting. As always, if you are out there, feel free to say hello. Drop your thoughts in the comments as well. We have a really good topic today. I'm really excited about the discussion on critical race theory. Last year around this time, it was really, really popping. And I don't know where it's at. To be honest, I don't follow and keep up with the critical race theory stuff. But I'm excited to talk to Jessica because she's here to share some of her thoughts on what it is and some challenges and some ways that we can kind of navigate throughout with this idea of things going on. So I'm really excited about this topic. So again, feel free to say hello. Now, Jessica Havens is a DEI consultant, strategist, coach, and facilitator. She's very passionate about this work. She and I were just talking earlier. She has a lot of things that she wants to share. So I'm going to bring her on right now because I don't want to waste too much more time. I'm really excited about this. So without further ado, Jessica, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sheldon. I'm excited to be here.
Pleasure is always mine. Now, I just shared with everyone that you are a DEI consultant, strategist, coach, and facilitator. But I'd love for you to share a little bit more about yourself and what else you do.
Sure. Yeah, DEI means lots of things to lots of people. So sometimes it means a lot, sometimes it doesn't mean much. I'm based in Denver right now from Chicago, and was a teacher in the public schools in Chicago for many years. I taught Spanish and Latin American studies, and really with a social justice focus in my classroom, and then worked at the university level. And that sort of brought me into diversity, equity, and inclusion work maybe about 10 years ago, when I realized that from my own life experience and my experience teaching and education, that I was a bridge builder. And so I use that in my work with organizations, which includes schools, but I work with businesses, organizations, to really create just more equitable and inclusive spaces and communities. So I'm really excited to be back here talking within the education field, because that's really what helped raise me within social justice spaces.
Awesome. Well, welcome to the show. Once again, it's a pleasure, it's an honor to be able to have this conversation with you. And I want to get started right now because you hear critical race theory, and I just refuse to say CRT, man. I just don't do it. I will say it every time because I felt like for me, critical race theory was kind of like a response to culturally responsive teaching or culturally relevant teaching. And I feel like because it's the same letters as far as the acronym goes. So that's why I normally will just say it. I don't say CRT, but I want to kind of start with the conversation on what exactly what do we mean by critical race theory?
Right. No, I'm with you on the acronym. So yeah, I think a lot of them started similar time periods. So, and I would just like to say for you viewers, I don't consider myself like a CRT expert. I have worked with the theory and I'm familiar with it, and I'm able to sort of connect the dots. So hopefully that will help everyone breathe a little bit as we move through this. But my experience with critical race theory and, Gloria Ladson-Billings is sort of our foremother in this work, and with culturally responsive pedagogies, it's really a graduate level theory.
Yeah.
Which is interesting that it's now on a mainstream, Fox News and CNN is talking about these things. It's really a graduate level theory that's attempting to explain why we have racial disparities in the United States, right? And in particular, it's arguing that that our laws and policies are connected to racism and white supremacy in this country, and really is like, it's really analysis of like laws and policies in general. So that's sort of what critical race theory is. And actually, when I was prepping for today, in case anyone's listening and wants a very short intro to it, I think last year when this was really hot, Gloria Latson-Billings recorded a 10-minute YouTube video that basically is like, here's what culturally responsive teaching is, right, for a layperson, for an everyday person. And it's really useful for any of your viewers. It's on YouTube. But yeah, that's sort of my understanding of it. And I'll stop there.
We'll stop there. Okay.
I'll stop
All
there,
right.
let me stop there so we can go back and forth. Yeah.
So, okay. So I think you and I are on the same page as far as our understanding. It's more on the laws and policies or things that have been put in place that have kept folks down. So, for example, what is it? Redlining would be an example of critical race theory when it comes to I am a person of color. I want to purchase a home, yet because of the way the system is and loan and all that stuff, it's intentionally only allowing me to buy from a certain area of within that city. Or that would be one example. Or maybe when we think about the population of prison inmates and the demographics that are represented within that, and how it's heavily favored. When what's the statistic? I think it's 1 in 3 Black males will have some time incarcerated. That would be another example of critical race theory. That's my understanding. Is that same as yours?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, I think of it as really looking at our systems and structures and institutions, as opposed to like individual bias and things like that, or this is happening because this racist white person runs this company. It's less that, and it's more looking at the language and the history of our laws and policies, and why the racial disparities that we see is really a result of laws, institutions, and policies. Yeah. So like policing, like redlining, like food access, like literally we're groceries, like we could literally create a whole matrix that might come out of a conversation or a class when you're studying critical race theory. And it's usually not taught until you're at the graduate level.
Okay. So then here's the question, and Jessica, to me, I mean, I think most people out there, most human beings can have seen those type of statistics, or at least heard those statistics. Like we talked about the prison system, we talked about housing, food insecurities, all those type of things. Why is that an issue? Like, why is there such a ban on critical race theory? Like, if these things have actually happened, if this is part of what the United States, or even on a global scale, why is this such an issue?
That's a huge question. So maybe where I'll start, because I think we have some historical things we can talk about. Maybe where I start is 2020, the last 2 years.
Okay.
Then we can kind of like go backwards a little bit. But why it's even in our lexicon, why everyday people are talking about something that, and no offense, but most people really don't even know what they're arguing about, right? Like it's kind of this like high level theory up here. But in 2020, you had, so you have the Trump administration, right, is starting to do bans on DEI trainings in general that are involving race, inclusivity, equity, any type of reckoning around race and power. And then I have his name written down here, Christopher Rufo, who's a conservative activist and reporter, brought this critical race theory into the news sort of out of nowhere. And was really basically saying that students were being indoctrinated. And as the media goes, it becomes these flashpoint conversations. And, we're already in extremely divisive times. And it literally just fed that. It fed this fuel. And their narrative, I would say, is successful in the sense that you have states all over the place attempting to legislate and mandate things that really aren't even critical race theory, but that's the bait. That's the bait that's pulling the narrative in this direction. But really anything under the umbrella of race, equity, identity, and really kind of misconstruing what's actually happening in classrooms, and really giving a very strong critique. And I think many of us are then scrambling to respond to these arguments when, we kind of need to come back to our grounding of what we know we're here to do. But that's sort of how the conversation came into the mainstream news the last 2 years. The deeper question is, why is there so much discomfort in this country
Mhm.
around discussing race and gender in particular? So when we're thinking about patriarchy and white supremacy as systems that we're operating in, why is there so much discomfort? And that's a bigger conversation, thinking about, in particular, white America and the ways that division has been strategically created and is continuing to be created in ways that don't know, like, not to kumbaya everything away, but that the average person in this country is struggling with like a lot of similar things,
Yeah.
honestly. And that when we're focused so much on divisive media, sort of propaganda campaigns, it gets away from the real conversation. And I could say more if you want to around sort of white people in the United States and some of that discomfort, but I'll pause for a second if you want to jump in.
Well, okay. So let's touch on the of conversation because I'm an equity. I don't consider myself an expert, but I am someone who's passionate about equity, and specifically racial equity. I'm a black man that lives in Idaho. I have 2 black kids that live in Idaho that have had all kind of challenges, and the reason why I started the show was to try to support people like my family, other families that I knew of color, and I just didn't know what to help or how to help them, and so I started the show. So I do a lot of racial equity work, and I get comments on Twitter or social media, from folks that will say, he's making divisive language, and that's something I want to touch on since you brought it up, as far as what makes it divisive. If I'm trying to bring awareness to individuals and say, hey, listen, I have a child who's the only person of color in her class, or she's one of a handful of people of color in her class. How do we make sure that she feels like she belongs there when she's in a school where, or an environment where there is predominantly white students there, and the content that they're getting is predominantly white? She goes to a Christian school. There's white Jesus all over the place. Like all these, like this is the environment that she's in. And so how do we make sure that folks like her feel safe, feel secure, and feel welcome in their environment? I don't understand how that can be considered a divisive language, but I get it. Like, I don't know if it's trolls or what, but it's just like I'll get those kind of comments about he's making these divisive language. But who's determining, I guess, Jessica, who's determining what's divisive and what's not? Like, why is that even a conversation?
Well, I don't mean to always blame the media, but I'm going to say the media actually, I feel like, has a very big piece in that
Mhm.
currently, because it sells division and drama and separation. All of those things sell. Um, I mean, I think because part of my background is my master's thesis was on anti-racist white identity development, and that
Mhm.
was a personal journey, and then it's what I bring into my work. Right,
Yeah.
is that there's two parts to your question. One, I do think that our movements for liberation, we do need to be able to be a bit self-reflective, right? And so I
Okay.
think some critiques of us are distractions, and I think some critiques are worth us wrestling with. And I
Okay.
do think that in this moment, there's a lot of spaces, schools, districts, institutions, like, start the conversation. They're like, oh, we want to do something about this. And so they start the conversation with like white privilege. And I'm like, there's so there's so many other things we need to impact before we even get to that conversation. And I know time is an issue, money is an issue, or we want to do a 45-minute training on microaggressions because we're seeing them, and it's important to address microaggressions, right? Like, that's a very actionable training that you can give.
Mhm.
Um, but I would say, in terms of being self-reflective, is how are we bringing people into that conversation when the truth is, I would say a lot of white conservative rural America, like, there's like a quiet, silent disenfranchisement that exists in this country, right? Where, and because of white supremacy's like been used, racism has been used as a tool, I would say, is to keep actual people from uniting. And
Mhm.
that a lot of rural poor folks, like, who are white, right, already feel disenfranchised, right? and they've already taken on the messaging that the browning of America, right, or this like push to be inclusive, right, is this long list of rules, like yet again, right, because they might not really see upward mobility in their family, right, they may be trying to get out of their town too. Is it's and you have I'm sort of losing my train of thought here, but you have basically it coupled with like lack of education even about any of these things, so you have all the adults in the system who aren't comfortable talking about race.
Mm-hmm.
And often, and some of that is conditioning, and some of that is also our messaging about why talk about race. How is race liberational for a white person to have a reckoning with, right? And so without recentering white people or the white parents, right, is how are we, yes, it is about your student and your child in that classroom as one of the few POC in a very white school, but like what is like the personal, why should a white parent care for their own child's sake? I mean, because we're all a little selfish, right, and centered on our families sometimes, right? Like why should they care about their kids diving into learning about power and race in the classroom or at school? Like how is that helpful? How is that redemptive in some ways? You know, like I always think about liberation and redemption. Like how is our curriculum and the things that we're doing focused in that direction? And unfortunately, when like the media keeps controlling the narrative, it's not helping a lot of us on the ground who are just like trying to do better for our communities.
You know, I hear what you're saying. I think I would say after I read White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo's book, it really, because I read it as a black person. And I just, I'm used to talking about race all the time.
Right.
That's just part of just how we grew up and how we're taught to navigate things like that. So I just felt like when I read her book, it just kind of brought the idea of there's a lot of white people that just do not like, they're just very uncomfortable with having that conversation. And I think that goes back to the idea of, oh, you're indoctrinating kids or you're teaching kids to hate America and all these things, because at the end of the day they just don't want to have those kind of conversations. So a lot of communities, especially the communities of color, will have those conversations about race, and they talk about it all the time, because a lot of things that, like you said, the media will show are racially based issues, hate crimes and all these type of things. So it makes sense that if it's a conversation that I don't like to talk about because it makes me feel uncomfortable for whatever reason, and if I'm in a position of power to change a law, or if I'm in a position of power to influence someone who can change laws, then why not do those type of things? That's what I think it is. I just, again, going back to whether or not I feel like I'm being divisive, I don't think
Oh,
I'm being divisive. I'm just trying to bring awareness, like, hey, this is not something that you have to experience. It's not something you have to think about. There's conversations that you won't have to have with your children, but they're conversations I have to have with my children. Not necessarily that I'm trying to bring more race into the classroom. I just want my daughter and my son to feel safe, secure, and welcome in the environment. If the only thing that they are getting when it comes to culture, or when it comes to anything that they can really grasp onto or relate to, comes from a civil rights movement, Dr. King, and just stuff to where folks of color, black folks, were trying to get civil rights, or just trying to get equal rights, or just trying to matter these days in 2022. Those kind of conversation. That's all we want. Some positive stuff. Like, we've done some really great things. There's
right.
some great things that just never are addressed or introduced to our students. And I really do think we're doing all of our kids a disservice when we don't really just branch out beyond just civil rights movements and those kind of conversations in school.
Well, yeah, all of that. And I think that's like the most common argument, right? And that's one of those arguments that I don't think is helpful, is saying people who want to discuss these things are being divisive, right? Because
Mhm.
division already exists. It's existed, whether
Yeah,
or not you want to put your head in the sand, it's existed. It's
that's
already
true.
here, you know? And so there's a Rumi quote that's it's the wound is the place where the light enters. And when I'm able to use like some spiritual language with folks, right, is that we have to look at the violence, right? We have to
Mhm.
look at the realness of what is before we can transcend it, before we can
Yeah.
move to the next stage. And I think there are many people in this country who don't want to do that, right? They don't realize we haven't done that. And they just want to jump to this stage, right? Like it's not necessarily like these crazy KKK people who are against critical race theory, right? Like some people are just like, I'm tired of talking about this, right? Like I don't even want to be there. Like, shouldn't we be over here? And it's like this balance, even in humanities, right? So the social studies classroom, or an English classroom, for example, right? We have to balance in this work when we're thinking about critical race theory, but really not like, it's really not like what we're actually talking about, is that balance between looking at systems of oppression, right? Looking at what is, naming it for what it is, and also like what is that those spaces of resistance and resilience in our history, right? We need to be teaching all of those things.
Yeah.
Otherwise, then it's like trauma porn. If you've ever heard people talk about that, right? Like, where is
wait, trauma porn? That's a thing?
It's not real. It's not like
It's a family show. This is a family show. No.
Okay,
I'm joking with you. I'm joking. I'm joking.
It's like it's not actual porn, but maybe it is.
I don't think it's a BDSM stuff.
Yeah, this is another show.
This is a kid show, okay? Family show.
But
Go ahead,
like this notion, sometimes those of us, and this is a real critique of and this is a tidbit for teachers. I fell in this when I was teaching. I had no idea what critical race theory was.
Yeah.
I didn't know what culturally responsive teaching was.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing culturally responsive teaching in my classroom. And in an attempt to talk about oppression, right, is that we can lean on that side of, it's just a tricky balance between offering liberation and hope, right? And like moments where all of our children can see themselves as resistors, right? As co-conspirators, because they have a lineage of that in our history, right? Like that's important for all of our young people, because like I know, like I could just fall in that camp of being like, okay, Black, brown, indigenous people have been oppressed. Europeans were colonizers. White people are just a mess, right? And all of these things, right? And some of that's true. And how do we, if we're going to be better in our classrooms, we have to expand how we're dealing with history and topics, and not just rely on like one more movie that's like a sad slave movie, right? While not jumping over that, right? So how are we like, like Black Panther, like that, like Afrofuturism, thinking about how we engage these collective positive Afro-Indigenous futures, right? Or sci-fi. There's so many ways we can be engaging these topics that's not just overly relying on looking at the pain point, right? We have to look at the pain point, and we have to do this other job. And so, yeah, I'm not sure.
Well, let's jump into that, because as far as the school, what does it look like in school, right? So we've kind of talked about critical race theory and media and all these things, and if again you get down to the root of it, it's more on the systemic type of historical systemic issues that have oppressed some groups of primarily people of color, right? Black, indigenous, Black people of color. So when we're thinking about, okay, I'm a former history teacher, and as like I know a lot of history teachers out there are a little leery about how do I teach history now, because critical race theory, it seems like everything is critical race theory these days.
Right.
Like literally everything is, oh, that's critical race theory. My friends that do social emotional learning, they're getting taking heat now because social emotional learning is considered critical race theory. Like I don't understand like anything, everything these days, if it ain't just straight up academics, anything outside of your traditional math, science, your academics seems to be a critical race theory plight. So what does it look like in schools? Are we teaching, are teachers out there teaching critical race theory? Is that a thing?
No, it's not a thing. So for the most part, right, unfortunately, because of the messaging that has worked on the national level, right, they were successful in their initial campaign around getting this terminology in people's minds. So it's become basically an umbrella term for anybody institutionally or at an education level, right? For anything that's basically engaging race, identity, and power. and attempting to use that, what, you know, in your curriculum, with your employees, whatever that is. And so it's funny because we're entitling this critical race theory, but it's almost like, I'm like, we shouldn't even be talking about it, but we kind of have to unpack it to then move to the other stage. I mean, I think a lot of teachers I know who went to go get a master's or a PhD ended up finding critical race theory somewhere in there. I didn't find it until I was studying critical whiteness studies, which is connected to ethnic studies. And that's the first time I learned about it, after I was already like out of the classroom. And so I think a lot of people in the classroom, you know, are still doing, you know, whether they call it liberational work or social justice work or culturally responsive, you know, pedagogies or teaching. Like, I think that's more people's frameworks. Critical race theory probably like helps give explanation to like the matrix of oppression and how that works. But what's happening in the schools is a pretty like basic level, I would say. That's my gauge on things, even if it's being like put in that box, you know. But I think, I mean, the thing is though, there's been a fight against ethnic studies in schools, which would be connected to this conversation, for a long time, especially in Arizona, a few other places. But like, you know, really this push to ban liberational curriculum that's really recentering, you know, BIPOC students and stories and histories, you know, to respond to the lack of that in our like traditional curriculum. And unfortunately, it's by a lot of adults who haven't themselves experienced, a lot of white adults who they themselves haven't experienced a transformational, you know, workshop or course or reading. You know, we're dealing with a lot of adults who don't actually know what they're talking about. But it's getting at this, like this core fear in this country. But my sense is that in schools, you know, teachers aren't labeling their work that way.
Yeah, I had a conversation. It's funny. So when I flew into the airport, I went to get my rental car, and the woman at the rental car counter, she was asking me what I do, and I was telling her, you know, I'm an educational consultant, and I'm headed down to do some speaking tomorrow. And she brought up the conversation about critical race theory, and something she said really resonated with me, because she was right. I just never thought about it that way. She was just like, you know, the whole story about Ruby Bridges. If you watch the movie, if you know her story about, like, you see all those white people that were out there and throwing, you know, saying all kind of stuff. She said those same parents are the same ones that are the main ones that are against critical race theory. They don't want that story to be told. So they didn't want her to go to the school, and then they don't want you to know about that. It's basically what she said. And I was like, I never thought about that.
Right.
But when you think about how there's stories that have happened that it's just that idea of like, we've always taught it this way. It's always been like, I remember those days reading my textbooks, getting ready to teach about World War I and World War II, or different things in U.S. history and all that stuff. And that has always been acceptable. And then over time, we start to learn that, oh, there were certain presidents that had slaves. There were, you know, there's a really good book called The Invisibles that I like to read, which talks about like the first few presidents up until I think Lincoln. Only the Adams, the father and son, were the only ones that did not have enslaved folks working in the White House, because it wasn't in the budget to clean the house, and someone needed to clean the house, so they were bringing in slaves for that. But that's conversation that we won't have. And under the whole umbrella of critical race theory, we're not supposed to talk about it. But I just think at the end of the day, we're doing our kids a disservice if we're not sharing everything that happened. Like, do you have kids, Jessica?
I don't. Mm-mm.
Okay.
I'm auntie to lots of children.
Okay.
But I have my
Okay. Okay, so I have two, right? And if I'm in one room and I hear a loud bang, boom,
Right.
boom, boom, and I hear one of my kids crying or screaming, I run in there and rush over and say, "What happened?" And I only ask one of my two children what happened, so I got one side of the story, and I don't get the other child's perspective. And I make a decision based off of that, or I operate based off of the one story that I got. I'm not getting the whole gist of it. To me, that is what's happening. It's like there's one side of the story that's being told, and they want to keep it that way, and they don't really want you to talk about, well, how other groups of people were impacted during these quote unquote historic events that happen in the United States?
Well, I might add to that it's not just that there's one side and one side isn't being told, but there's like multiple sides not being
Yeah.
told. Right? Because the story that's told in traditional, say, textbooks, right,
Yeah.
around these is generally not following working class white people, right?
Mhm.
Or Irish indentured servants, right? Or the process Italians went through in this country.
Mhm.
You know, it's generally not engaging in a depth way, right? You're sort of getting this picture, and it's really about the elites in history, right? And
True.
it's about the
True.
plantation class of, white people, European Americans, and that their perspective of what has happened. And so,
Mhm.
I'm someone who's always been obsessed with race and gender. That's sort of like my entry into this conversation. But I was reminded as I was thinking about this, and I'm thinking about how divided this country is, and I was reminded back to learning about Dr. King's, the Poor People's Campaign, and that it was when not only he started critiquing the Vietnam War, but when he started talking about class, that he
Mhm.
became a real threat, because that had the potential to actually unite people, right? And without sidestepping, again, I'm not trying to like recenter white people in the conversation, but just more expand our conversation as we're thinking about culturally responsive pedagogy and like how to move forward. Is I think there are multiple stories that haven't been told.
Mhm.
um, and the fact that like men are the people who have written and continue to sort of control the narrative
Mhm.
around power and identity and all of those pieces. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot going on there, and I
Yeah.
and I keep coming back to how is, because I think, like our white boys are not doing okay. They are not okay. I'm just that is my they
What
might
do
be
you mean?
like they might be okay financially, right? So
Mhm.
we have, white men still running most corporations and the government. But when I'm just walking around Denver, okay, or I'm walking around Chicago, and I'm looking at white male behavior. I'm looking at, or we're looking at school shootings, or we're looking at mental health. And I'm not saying that that's not because of our curriculum, right? But when I'm thinking about where we move I from identity politics, right? And a lot of us come into culture responsive teaching because we're really particularly wanting to engage and empower Black and Brown young people,
Mhm.
right? And or students who have been on the margins, right? And so we recenter, bell hooks, right? We're going to place ourselves in the margins. For us to just start thinking expansively, especially for people who have diverse classrooms in terms of they've got white, Black, brown, mixed class. For people who have diverse classrooms, some of these conversations can be more complicated. Um, you know, you have lots of scenarios like right where your kids are in, right, where you have a predominantly white school and a few students of color, right? And then
Mhm.
there's other teachers who are engaging like students from a bunch of backgrounds. Is how do we then expand like the brilliance that is culture responsive pedagogy, which it's to me it's brilliant. How do we expand that to also, again, I'm going to keep coming back to how is our curriculum learning about a moment in US history? How can we find ways to make sure that all of our people in our classrooms are engaged, right? And
Mhm.
so to to be a white straight male in the United States means that you are not as connected honestly to reality as a lot of other people are, right? Because of your experience of privilege, you've been shielded like multiple steps behind what's actually happening.
Mhm.
And I think you can connect it to white fragility. I think you connect it to like just like mental health. We can talk about, like why boys and men are struggling in general around what their role in society is, or what's the point of living, what's the point of going to school. But I guess that's what I mean by like white boys are not okay.
Mhm.
So we might say they're getting, oh, you're going to have social capital or you're going to get privilege because of your identities. But from like a spiritual, emotional level, I do think I'm concerned, especially because they are in control of so many things. I'm concerned and about that its connection to violence and its connection to like the future of our country.
Okay. I see
Does
where
that
you're
make
going.
sense? That's what,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I just wanted to clarify. Okay, I see where you're going. Now, let me ask you this because I don't want to spend the entire
Mhm.
episode on the
Yeah.
perils of critical race theory. Let's shift gears just a moment
Yeah.
and let's talk about maybe some strategies. If we don't have to limit it to just a classroom or schools,
Yeah.
but what are some of your thoughts on navigating through this? I guess responding, maybe. I don't know if that's the best word to ask, but I don't know. What are some of your tips or strategies regarding overcoming or just getting I'm trying to figure out the best way to ask the question, but basically, what tips do you have for folks out there in
Yeah.
regards to critical race theory?
Yeah. I feel you. Um, I think on a district and school level,
Hmm.
I think like parent and community engagement is really important. And I'm not sure the word critical race theory should be in any of that.
Okay.
We're talking about it here so we can kind of like piece it apart and then, like sort of figure it all out. I don't think it's necessarily useful for schools or, to be using any of that language. So and if I may, I just wanted to make a connection to like some legislation that just happened in
Sure,
Kansas
go for it.
around there was a major amendment this week my dad actually brought to my attention, and it was attempting to ban sort of abortion with no exceptions on the state level, and it actually failed like dramatically. And this is a state that's very conservative. And I started looking at the ads, and it was very interesting because their ad campaign against this amendment didn't use your like trigger words, didn't use our like go-to conversation that many of us in like liberal circles, when we're feeling very self-righteous or like, like, no, like we are gonna like say it this way because this is what needs to be said.
Hmm.
um, they didn't go in that direction, and they attempted to use languaging around sort of constitutional freedom and body autonomy, things that they thought would speak to multiple communities. And so they had overwhelmingly conservative communities voting down this amendment. And why it's interesting to note within this conversation is when we're thinking about community and parent engagement, right? Is like critical race is not helpful. It's not helpful necessarily for us to be responding to the narrative that somebody over here is making us respond to, right? Is like,
Hmm.
I think parent and community engagement, like we need to, maybe it's a book study of your book, right? Or we're just talking about, conversations about race, going back to the courageous conversations on race. Some of those community dialogues maybe need to be revisited, right?
Mm.
Before we just do a dive into like privilege, right? Which can put a lot of people on the defense when there's no social emotional, adults need social emotional supports too. We have backgrounds, we have trauma, we have experiences, right? And so one of the pieces that I would advocate for districts and DEI departments, people who are lucky enough to have that, is just to start at the parent level, because parents are the ones who are like getting sound bites, and then they're going to speak out at their boards and are in many ways, and it's not to poo-poo parents, but many people who don't even know what they're like advocating against, right?
Yeah.
Shutting down these processes. And I think we just need to be willing to actually engage them, like with a skilled facilitator around race and identity and people's stories, like not even going into history, like just start with the person, and being able to work at that level. Even though I know a lot of people are, resources are hard to come by, but that would be the first piece I would just advocate on the district level or school level.
And it's not even just sound bites. Like there are organizations that will give you scripts word for word. This is what you say to the school board. This is what you say
Right.
to the principal or whoever regarding critical race theory. And kind of like what you said, unfortunately, folks will just memorize those or read that off, but not really understanding the full grasp from an educational standpoint
Right.
what they're asking for. Again, I feel like the whole idea of critical race theory has just kind of muddied things, just kind of caused a lot of confusion. And then going back to the critical culturally responsive teaching, you have the same acronyms. and how all of that gets thrown in together, and then equity was already something that people were getting mixed up with equality, and so it's just there's just a bunch I just think there's a bunch of misunderstanding, and just kind of like what you were saying, like maybe just having some opportunities to really just sit down with parents,
Right.
administration, just sit down with parents and just have some dialogue. I've been in some community forums where that was the attempt was, okay, we're going to open up this space as a district leader, we're going to bring Sheldon in, because we did some work with him, and but the parents were already so angry and so upset
Right.
that there really wasn't any there wasn't it wasn't going to go anywhere. You know what I'm saying? Like they already came with their minds made up. So I think not only do I feel like we should come together at some point, but at least come with an open mind.
Right.
I would say needs to be added into that conversation. But if you're already coming into a space and you're fired up already, it doesn't really matter what I have to say. It doesn't matter what anybody has to say. You're already made, your mind is made up, and really for things for things to really change, for really good conversation dialogue, it really needs to be an open mind type of conversation.
And also not a one-time conversation.
Yeah.
Like, we're going to talk about race on Thursday night. Like, okay, like that sounds like a disaster. Like that sounds like, if you want to ask me, like I wouldn't do that. Like not useful unless you have a super skilled facilitator. You know, you can do affinity groups.
Yeah.
I generally advocate, like when I'm coaching or consulting organizations, like if they can do some type of cohort model. So on a school level or district level, maybe it's a group of parents, and I pulled up this book here. I don't know the author, so I'm just giving her a free shout out because I use her book all the time. Annalise Singh. It's the Racial Healing Handbook. And I've actually worked with groups multiple times with, like, I've created a course around this book. And what I love about this book is it's step by step. It's like 8 chapters as worksheets, reflections. Like a group of people could actually facilitate themselves probably with this. And it's, you know, sometimes these materials are geared towards white people or geared towards men, and they don't say that they are, right? And they're making POC sit through a training that's really like not for them, right? Or, you know, what I love about this book is that it speaks to POC and it speaks to white people, like for every section of the book.
Okay.
And it starts with race and identity, like from scratch. So it starts from the beginning, and like some basic concepts around socialization. And yeah, if you find
what's the book called again?
It's called the Racial Healing Handbook.
I'm going to try to see if I can get her on the show. Racial Healing Handbook.
Yeah, you should definitely get her on the show. She doesn't know me. I love her, and I love her work. So it's practical activities to help you challenge privilege, confront systemic racism, and engage in collective healing. And so the goal of the book is healing, which I like as a framework for working with parents and community members. Because you get to bring in your own story, right? You're not like, hey, shut up, and I'm going to tell you 10 things not to do. Like, don't do them, don't do this, and then you won't be racist, you won't be transphobic, you know. And
that'll end it right there. This is all you need to do. Here's a recipe, and then you're gonna come out. Yeah.
And if you don't do them, you'll be canceled. And it's just like, okay, we need to work on some of our messaging around this. Like, we need to make some of this work attractive to people who are not in our circles, right? Because not everybody is an extreme right. You know, like most people aren't over there. We have a lot of people in the middle who are kind of confused and maybe not very self-reflective, or, you know, just need some support moving through these things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I definitely parent and community engagement, especially because they're controlling this right now, and they're connected to elections. And, you know, I just think we can talk about the classroom, but, you know, adults right now are like a major part of the issue.
Okay, so not just a one and done forum, but maybe engaging in more of a community collaborative study session, and a book that you recommended could be an option to utilize as well. Would you suggest any other strategies that maybe could help with, you know, or should we just ignore this as teachers and just do our thing? Like, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts there?
Well, just before I go to there, just, I know I mentioned it, but just going back to, you know, we're always pushing for social emotional learning in the class. Like, that's how we talk about in education. But just remember, when we're talking with adults, we always want to think about how this work is speaking to people's hearts, even when we're in this like technical, we have to be in this box and we're, you know, teaching or we're talking about these things, is how are we, you know, engaging not just the young people, but like the adults, right? And in people's stories, and how do you bring in, and how do you sort of validate people's experiences as you push them to sort of expand and say, okay, this has been your experience, right?
Yeah.
And then how can we get you to understand a bigger picture? For teachers, I think, I mean, a lot of people listening to this are probably already super dynamic social justice warriors at their schools, and they're probably just going to keep doing what they're doing, right? Like, keep doing what you're doing. I'm not here to like give you some magic tools. Like, there's brilliance already exists out in the world, you know? One thing I would just suggest as we move into the future is taking, again, when we're looking at our curriculum, right? So the beginning of the year, many people have already started teaching, but if you're coming to teaching and you're really wanting to have, you know, just like a critical classroom where you're critically engaging with the world, right? Is just always coming back to the question I brought up earlier, right? Is how are all students, and we're taking these lessons from culturally responsive teaching, right? From ethnic studies, is kind of full circle. How are all of my students, how does this information help give them not only a better understanding of themselves, right, and the greater world, but also like hope and liberation, where there's a lot of hopelessness, I mean, going on. Like, I can't even imagine being in the classroom right now with teenagers, right? There's a lot just in terms of what's happening in society, right? And that they're with a lot of adults who don't know what's happening, right? Or like, everything changed like the last 2 years, like the world is kind of, there's a lot of things that have been flipped upside down. And so, you know, just to be mindful of our curriculum of like, how is this, you know, am I getting into this framework of, I'm, you know, I'm saying like victim oppressor, like I'm just teaching these pieces from a very maybe surface level topic, you know, way. And I think we just need to, I just would ask teachers to just go a step beneath that, right? To just ask, like, how are we presenting multiple stories of multiple people? So that, you know, I mean, my goal is always going to be liberation and unity. That's like part of my goal for this work, right? And there's tough conversations to be had to get to that place. But I definitely, just in terms of how teachers are looking over their curriculum, there's not a big ask here because teachers already have too much going on. But just to look over their curriculum and say, where are their spaces for hope and resilience and joy in how we're understanding history and ourselves and the future. Like, is it all doomed? You know, like, do we give up on white people? Do we give up on men? Do we give up on the United States? Do we give up on any sense of like redemption, right? And how do we engage some of these pieces?
Yeah. I think
I mean, I sometimes give up on white people. I give up on, you know, I it's not that I don't feel those things.
You can't give up. You can't give up, man.
Exactly. You know? But I mean, I get it. Like, you know, I'm always, you know, white people move in the world and they represent me. And so I walk into a room, and the rooms I walk into, right, like, people have not had positive experiences with white folks. So that impacts I have a very personal reason why I do this work, you know?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, just use that as a general lens. It's like my big, like, if there's a takeaway for teacher besides these larger societal issues, is just like, all right, like, just take a glance at your curriculum and how are you bringing student stories into the space.
Yeah, exactly right. And the only thing I would add to that is, you know, it's just kind of like my favorite book of all time, educational book at least, is Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Right.
And where Freire talks about, you know, how we typically are the banking system and the importance of two-way communication / co-learning, like learning from your students as well. When you're doing those type of assignments where you want your kids to think critically, allowing them to really do their own research on certain topics, whatever subject you're teaching, but allowing them the opportunities to do some real research behind certain things. And it could be a project-based assessment or things like that, where they're collaborating and working together. Then you're giving them more buy-in, and you're letting them really look at things. You just like challenge your students. Like be
Yeah.
like, rather than here's the textbook, here's the assignment, blah blah blah. No, I really want you to dig deep. I want you to find as much as you can on this topic, on this subject, on this area, and come together and work as a group, as a team, to figure out what's the best process, or at least present this to other students. To me, if we take things on that way, the kids are going to be able to discover a lot of things. I mean, technology these days, I mean, think about how internet was when we were growing up. It's not nowhere near like what was it, Ask Jeeves and Yahoo were the big deals back when I first started getting on the internet and those kind of things. Like, there's so much information that's readily available out there right now, and just letting kids be able to do their own self-discovery, I think, is really important. That takes away some of that pressure as a teacher that, oh, I might say the wrong thing, or oh, I'd have the wrong thing in my classroom, and I could get myself in trouble. When you put more buy-in on your students and allowing them to learn themselves, to me that just makes more sense.
Right. Yeah. And I love for any educators who have the ability to do this within your like subject area, is I did this at the university level, but I would have done this at the high school level if had I known what I knew when I was, teaching, is doing as much autoethnographic work. I think that can be used, allowing students to write and process their own lives within the context of whatever the subject is. Especially for when I was teaching my classroom at the university level, they're all like 19-year-olds, very diverse racially from across the country, class-wise. Like it was a joy, like, and also a challenge to be in such a diverse classroom. But a lot of a lot of like my white students were struggling with, like understanding your roots. Like there's been a lot of people in this country are cut off from their actual roots, right? Yeah. Whether it was through enforcement, through enslavement, right? Or through access to power. And just over time, you learned like it was better to be white, right? Than was connected to your cultural roots. And I see that but particularly interestingly with white and Black communities, right? Is like wrestling with roots. And even cultural heritage. And I would just say like, autoethnographic work in the classroom and allowing students to write about their experiences and then connecting that to the content is so powerful. Like, cause and young people, especially teenagers, they love to talk about themselves. Right. And so, it's always if you don't know what to do, like always like get them to connect to their lives. Like, how is this related to you?
There you go. Yeah. I'm with you. So I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, Jessica. We've gone all different directions,
all over the place,
and that's what I like about doing these conversations, because you never know. I never know where the conversation will end. But I'd love for you to share maybe any final thoughts or something that we haven't touched on that you would like to add to the conversation.
Whew, final thoughts. I think just not spending too much time defending critical race theory. I mean, I think that's useful for some people in the academy. I think a lot of you are already doing incredible work, and I want you to just continue that work and allow us all to expand of what is the future we want. What is the future we want for our kids? The world has changed quite a bit in 2 years. And allowing that to help us motivate how we're working with families and community members and young people, and really understanding the human element of this all, right? Even when we're talking about the people who we feel like are fear-mongering, right? If they're in our community, right? Like where is that fear coming from? Like, how do we actually address some of the roots of this like whole debate, right? How do we address those in our classroom? How do we address those with our teachers? And really like having a very human-centric approach, which I would say sometimes in social justice spaces, we don't always do the best, right? And we really want to sometimes think about like, how are we kind of rebranding, to use like business language, like rebranding or finding new and innovative ways to talk about this work and to talk about really hard conversations while keeping like the human heart in mind. So I guess that would be some of my last thoughts.
I love it. Jessica, if we got some folks that want to connect with you, what's the best way to get in touch? How can they find you and the work that you're doing?
Awesome. Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn under my name, and then my website, jessicahavens.com. has some presentations I've done. And yeah, that's the best way to contact me. And I love capacity building is my specialty. So facilitation and dialogue, working with leadership, working with employees, working with young people, and dialogue facilitation. I have several colleagues of color that I partner with in those spaces. So yeah, hit me up if you got anything. And I love to be on podcasts. So I'm looking to do more public speaking and just engaging in conversation with people. Like I get, this gives me like life. This is awesome. So
Yeah, it was good. Now, did you share your socials as well?
LinkedIn.
Oh, LinkedIn. Okay. I didn't know
Yeah,
if you
I don't do
mentioned
Facebook.
Twitter. Okay.
Yeah, I don't do Facebook. I don't do Twitter. Instagram is personal. So yes,
LinkedIn.
my website or LinkedIn. Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you again, Jessica. It has truly been a pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation.
Yes, I did too. Thank you so much. And congratulations on your book.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, folks, we're going to wrap up today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. You know, one of the things I love about podcasting is I might have an agenda as far as what the topic is going to be, and it can go all different directions. So I appreciate you for paying attention and learning about our thoughts with regards to critical race theory. What's happening today. You know, again, I remember this was really big last year or so, and I just wanted to get a pulse check and see where things were at right now. One big takeaway that I have at the end of the day from Jessica was the importance of understanding the human side of our kids, and the ideas of possibly, if we're trying to figure this out, coming together, whatever side you're coming from, but engaging in some consistent dialogue with an open mind. I think those type of things were some of the things that really resonated with me with today's conversation. So remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King. Oh, as we close out, again, one more reminder: if you haven't purchased the book already, Leading Equity, Becoming an Advocate for All Students. Yes, I'm going to pitch it every single time. I'm very excited about that book. And if you have read the book, feel free to write a review on Amazon. That's always helpful as well. But we're going to close out. I will see you next week. I should be in town, should be at home. So have my usual setup. But let's remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But by all means, keep moving. Let's continue to be a voice in leading equity.